The cold was a creature of the castle, a thing with teeth that lived in the marble floors and crept up the stone pillars to breathe frost onto the high, arched windows. Princess Alara felt it not in her skin, but in her bones, a familiar ache that had settled deep within her marrow 7 years ago. It was the same age as her solitude. She stood apart from the glittering throng in the great hall, a ghost in gray silk, her presence tolerated only by the mandate of her royal blood. A princess, yes, but an Omega princess. In a kingdom that worshipped the fire of alphas, she was little more than ash. Her dignity was a coat she wore, woven from silence and stillness. She kept her chin level, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the tapestries depicting her ancestors' bloody victories. She did not look at the courtiers who angled their bodies away from hers, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. She did not look at her father, the king, his jaw a hard line of disappointment whenever his gaze accidentally brushed over her. She did not look at her brothers, both brash, confident alphas, who saw her as a stain on their family's honor. To look was to invite pity, or worse, to acknowledge the scorn. And so she looked at nothing, and in doing so, became nothing. The air in the hall shifted, a subtle change in pressure, a prickle of anticipation. The herald's voice, booming and self-important, bounced off the stone. Announcing Her Majesty, Queen Seraphina of the Glacial Spire, sovereign of the northern wastes. A silence fell, thick and heavy with reverence. Alara allowed her eyes to drift toward the entrance. Through the sea of velvet and brocade, she saw her. The northern queen was not what she'd expected. The tales spoke of a savage, a warrior queen cloaked in furs and smelling of blood. But the woman who entered was grace forged from iron. She was tall, her bearing regal, with hair the color of spun silver braided with black jewels. Her eyes, a startling ice blue, missed nothing. She was an alpha, that was plain to see. It radiated from her like heat from a forge, a palpable aura of power and command that made every other alpha in the room, including the king, seem a lesser fire. A thing stirred in Alara's chest, a wretched, fluttering creature she had long thought dead. Hope. It was a poison, a sweet lie she could not afford to taste. She crushed it instantly, ruthlessly. Why would this queen be any different? Power respected power. An alpha queen would see an omega princess and see only a weakness, a flaw in the lineage of a potential ally. She would see what everyone else saw, a failure. Alara's heart, that stupid, traitorous organ, gave another painful lurch. She commanded it to be still. Her father moved forward, his formal smile plastered on his face. Her brothers flanked him, perfect specimens of alpha pride. They formed a wall, a human shield of welcome that also served, as it always did, to obscure her from the view of esteemed guests. It was a familiar choreography, a dance of shame she knew by heart. She watched them bow, heard the murmur of pleasantries. The queen's voice was low, a melodic contralto that carried a hint of the frozen winds of her homeland. It sent a shiver down Alara's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She forced herself to retreat again, to rebuild the walls around her heart. She focused on the frayed silver thread on the cuff of her glove, a tiny imperfection she could anchor herself to. 1 breath. 2. The world would continue as it always had. The queen would be escorted to the dais, there would be toasts and speeches, and Alara would remain in her shadowed corner, a piece of forgotten furniture. The evening would end, and she would return to her cold, quiet rooms, her solitude unbroken. It was a bleak comfort, but it was a predictable one. There were no surprises in a life lived in the margins. The formal greetings seemed to be concluding. Alara braced herself for the procession to the high table, the moment when the entire court would turn and she would be most exposed, most invisible. But the procession did not begin. Queen Seraphina had lifted her head, her piercing blue gaze sweeping across the assembled nobles. It was not a casual glance, it was an assessment, a search. The power in that look held the entire hall captive. Lords and ladies froze, their sycophantic smiles stiffening on their faces. The queen's eyes moved past the preening alphas, past the bedecked ladies of the court, past the king himself. They moved, and then they stopped. On her. For a heartbeat, Elara was certain she was mistaken. It was impossible. No one of importance had looked directly at her for 7 years. They looked through her, around her, past her. But there was no mistake. The Alpha Queen was looking at her, and only at her. The air thickened, growing heavy and charged. The whispers died, replaced by a profound, unnerving silence. Every head in the hall turned, following the Queen's gaze, their collective focus a physical weight that threatened to crush Elara. They saw the Queen looking. And so, for the first time, they saw her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile shell of her composure. Her carefully constructed armor of invisibility was gone, stripped away by a single, unwavering stare. She wanted to flee, to gather her gray skirts and run from the hall, from the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her. But her feet were lead, fused to the marble floor. Her blood had turned to ice. All she could do was stand there, exposed and trembling, caught in the brilliant, terrifying blue of the Queen's gaze. Then, Queen Seraphina began to move. She did not walk toward the king or the offered seat of honor. She walked toward Elara. Each step was deliberate, silent, her dark leather boots making no sound on the polished stone. The sea of courtiers parted before her as if by an unseen force, creating a wide, clear path from the center of the hall to Elara's lonely corner. The walk seemed to take an eternity. Time stretched and thinned, until every second was a lifetime of suffocating tension. Elara's heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, frantic and loud in the dead silence. What did she want? The question screamed in Elara's mind. Was this some new, cruel form of entertainment? To single out the court's pariah and humiliate her before a foreign delegation? To make an example of her weakness? The thought was a bitter acid in her throat. Her brother, Kale, took a half step forward, his expression a mixture of fury and embarrassment. He was preparing to apologize for her, to explain away her pathetic existence. The shame burned hotter than the cold. The Queen stopped. She was a mere arm's length away now, and the sheer force of her presence was overwhelming. She smelled of pine and snow and something else, something uniquely alpha that called to the deepest, most hidden parts of Elara's Omega nature. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. Elara forced herself to meet that glacial gaze, refusing to bow her head. If this was to be her final, ultimate degradation, she would face it with the last shred of dignity she possessed. She lifted her chin, her body trembling, but her spine straight. The entire world held its breath. And then Queen Seraphina did something no one could have predicted. Something that broke every rule of protocol, every law of power and station. She knelt. The sound of her armored knee connecting with the marble floor was a sharp crack that echoed through the cavernous hall. It was the sound of a world breaking. Gasps erupted, a wave of collective shock rippling through the stunned court. An Alpha Queen, a visiting sovereign, did not kneel. Not to anyone. And certainly not to a shunned Omega princess in a forgotten corner of the room. Elara stared down at the bowed head, at the intricate silver braid that descended over one shoulder. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by years of silent suffering. It could not be real. Alphas did not kneel. They ruled. They commanded. They did not submit. Slowly, Queen Seraphina lifted her head. Her ice-blue eyes met Elara's, and in their depths, there was no pity. There was no mockery. There was an intensity that burned, a raw, possessive fire that seemed to see past the gray dress, past the years of shame, and into the very core of her soul. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it cleaved the silence and reached every corner of the hall. It was a vow, a decree, a claim. She's mine. The two words fell into the silence, and the silence shattered. Elara felt the statement like a physical blow, not of violence, but of impact. It struck the center of her being, cracking the frozen surface of her heart. Mine. The word reverberated in the space between them, an invisible chain forged in that single, impossible moment. It was a shield thrown up around her. It was a gauntlet thrown down before her family. Her father's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. Her brothers looked as if they had been slapped. The courtiers, moments ago so confident in their scorn, were now a gallery of gaping mouths and widened eyes, their expressions shifting from disdain to confusion, and then to a dawning, fearful respect. They were not looking at her anymore, not the real her. They were looking at an object, a possession of the formidable Northern Queen. The world tilted on its axis, spinning dizzily. Alara's breath hitched, a tiny, audible gasp. The carefully maintained control she had clung to for 7 years crumbled into dust. Tears pricked the backs of her eyes, hot and sharp. She fought them back. She would not weep. Not now. Queen Seraphina rose to her feet with a fluid, powerful grace. The height difference was significant, and Alara had to crane her neck to look up at her. The queen's expression was unreadable, but the fire in her eyes had not dimmed. Before Alara could think, before she could react, Seraphina reached out. Not to take her hand in a gesture of alliance, but with a tenderness that was utterly at odds with her warrior's reputation. Her fingers, warm and calloused, gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Alara's cheek, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was lightning. A jolt of pure, unadulterated warmth that shot through Alara's entire body, chasing away the bone-deep chill for the first time in years. It was an intimate gesture, a possessive one, performed for the entire court to witness. It was a seal on her declaration. This one, this forgotten one, belongs to me. Her skin tingled where the queen had touched her, the sensation a brand of impossible heat. Seraphina's hand dropped, but she did not move away. Instead, she shifted her stance slightly, placing her body as a partial shield between Alara and the rest of the room. It was a subtle, protective posture, claiming the space around Alara as her own territory. From behind the sudden, living wall of strength and warmth, Alara watched her father's face contort with a complex rage. He was trapped. To insult her now was to insult the queen who had claimed her. "Your Majesty," Seraphina said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone as she finally addressed the king. She did not turn fully toward him, her attention still primarily on Alara, as if ensuring she would not bolt, or perhaps that no one would dare approach her. "It seems your court has misplaced one of its most precious jewels. I am merely retrieving it." The words were a silken insult, a direct challenge to the king's rule and his treatment of his own daughter. A jewel. No one had ever thought of her as anything more than a stone, dull and worthless. Alara's mind was a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, burgeoning warmth. This couldn't be happening. Queens did not rescue forgotten princesses from their own families. Such things did not happen outside of children's fables. And yet, the solid presence of the woman beside her was irrefutable. The lingering heat on her cheek was real. The stunned silence of the court was real. For 7 years, she had been a ghost. She had perfected the art of being unseen, of taking up no space, of making no sound. She had wrapped her loneliness around her like a shroud and called it dignity. Now, in the space of a few heartbeats, a foreign queen had walked into the heart of her desolate kingdom, knelt at her feet, and set the entire world on fire. The hope she had tried to murder just moments before was resurrected, no longer a fragile flutter, but a roaring inferno in her chest. It was terrifying. Hope was a dangerous, untamed beast, and Alara had no idea how to handle it. It could lead to salvation, or it could lead to a pain far greater than the numb ache of her solitude. Seraphina turned her head slightly, her ice-blue eyes finding Alara's again. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them, a question, perhaps, or a promise. Alara didn't know what this meant, where this was going. She didn't know if this was a political maneuver, a whim, or something else entirely. She knew only one thing with a certainty that shook her to her very foundations. The long, cold winter of her life had just met the glacial force of a northern storm. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same. The silence of the hall stretched on, a taut wire of anticipation, and for the first time, Alara felt like she was on the right side of it. She stood behind the shield of the Alpha Queen and breathed.